The weather's getting cooler now, so it's time to talk about hot and sour soup. Two things that we're going to talk about today are the basics to making egg drop soup and seasoning soup to taste. The ingredients come out to be just under $17 for 6 hearty servings. For ingredients, we have boneless country style pork ribs, black vinegar, tofu, shiitake mushrooms, cilantro, arbol chilies, chicken broth, and 2 eggs. You can use any cut of pork for this recipe, but I happen to be using country style pork ribs because it is the cheapest 1 pound package cut that I have at the grocery store. And what we're doing here is we're slicing it into strips and then we're going to marinate it in our typical soy, sesame oil, sugar, and cornstarch. A lot of recipes call for dry reconstituted mushrooms, but I actually like fresh shiitake mushrooms because I think it just gives a nice mild but still deep flavor. The type of tofu that I'm using here is a Japanese style firm silken tofu that you can actually order on Amazon because it actually doesn't need to be refrigerated. This tofu has a really awesome balance of being really delicate and yet it won't fall apart in a soup or even in a stir fry. Now that we have everything prepared, we're going to heat some vegetable oil at medium-high heat and we're going to brown this in batches. So in this particular case, it's going to take 2 batches and all that soy, sugar, and cornstarch and pork fat is just going to create a nice fond at the bottom of the pan and impart a huge amount of flavor to the rest of the soup. Now we add the arbols and ginger and the mushrooms as well as a splash of rice wine or water to deglaze all that goodness. Now we cover the pot to cook the mushrooms and let the broth from the mushrooms mix in with all that other goodness. At this point you have this really nice concentrated base of all the flavors together that serves as the basis for the soup. And now we add our chicken broth and bring it almost to a boil. So here's the basics to egg drop soup. You got chicken broth, a cornstarch slurry, and beaten eggs. A cornstarch slurry is a 2-to-1 ratio of water to cornstarch, and in this case, a quarter cup of cornstarch to a half cup of water. The trick is to have some hot broth, but not to a boil, otherwise when you add the cornstarch slurry, it'll turn really clumpy really fast. If you stir it in and then heat it gradually to the point that it's bubbling, you'll get a nice Ghostbusters 2 level of ooze going. How thick you like your soup is entirely up to you, and this is at the point where you can add more cornstarch slurry or not. So while it's bubbling, you drop in a little bit of egg, a little bit at a time, so as not to cool off the broth too fast. Otherwise, you'll have a nice custard on your hands. But you don't want that. You want these awesome little strands of egg flowers, if you will. If you're like me and don't want to waste any egg, just pour in some hot soup back into that bowl with your eggs and then pour it back in. And now we can add our pork and our tofu. If you taste the soup right now, it should be just a bit too salty and just a bit too spicy. And that's fine because the tofu over the next half hour is going to mellow out all the flavors. And at this point, we're going to add about a whole cup of Taiwanese black vinegar. Now, Taiwanese black vinegar is pretty mild, and so if you're using white vinegar, I would actually start with a 1/4 cup and then add a little bit as you go. I've tried a ton of different vinegars for this recipe, and in the end, this particular vinegar is by far my favorite, so I'm including a link in the description so that you can check it out. At this point, you're now going to let it sit for about a half hour, and in a half hour, that's when you adjust again for maybe a little bit more vinegar, maybe a little bit more soy, but if it's too not spicy enough, then instead of arbol chilies, go with chili oil. And there's nothing wrong with having some vinegar, soy sauce, chili oil at the table side anyway. And white pepper is an essential condiment to this dish. Top it with some cilantro or green onion, and you're good to go. This is by far my favorite dish for the fall. What's your favorite dish when the weather is cooling down? Let me know in the comments.